Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew, and in this video we're going to be looking at one of the most diverse republics of the Russian Federation, the Karachay-Cherkess Republic. The Karachay-Cherkess Republic is located in the south of Russia, in the North Caucasian Federal District and in the North Caucasian Economic Region. It is the 77th largest federal subject and over 5,500 square miles in size, making it slightly larger than the Bahamas. It has a population of over 450,000 people, making it the 74th most populous federal subject by rank and with more people living here than in Brunei. Notably, it makes up one of the 11 republics where Russians are the minority, at just over a quarter of the population. The name of the republic comes from its two primary ethnic groups, the Karachays, a Turkic ethnic group related to the Balkars, and the Cherkess, or Circassians, also called the Adygia. Alongside Russian, both Karachay-Balkar and Adygia are official languages in the republic, as well as Abazin and Nogai. This is because a substantial Abazin and Nogai population call this republic home, for reasons we will discuss later on. The Karachay-Cherkess Republic is bordered by the Krasnodar Krai to the west, the Stavropol Krai to the northeast, and the Kabardino-Balkar Republic to the southwest. It also shares borders with the nations of Abkhazia to the southwest and Georgia to the south. Mountains dominate this country at 86% of all terrain, with forested terrain making up over 30%. Despite playing a significant role in the local economy, agricultural land does come in at just under 10% of all land used. The highest point in the republic is Mount Elbrus at 5,642 meters tall. This is actually the shared highest point with the Kabardino-Balkar Republic, as Mount Elbrus crosses over both of these republics. As mentioned in that video, the mountain has significance for both the Karachay-Balkar and Circassian communities. The name is theorized to have come from the Persian Halbolas, meaning high peak, but in the Karachay-Balkar language, the mountain is called Mingi Tau, meaning the eternal mountain. To the Circassians, this is simply the holy mountain. The longest river in the republic is the Kuban, of which 170 kilometers flows through Karachay-Cherkessia. Whilst the Kuban is the longest river flowing through the republic, there are over 170 other rivers that flow through there, as well as over 100 glacial lakes. The republic is divided into 10 administrative districts, with the capital of Cherkessk acting as its own administrative district. Similarly to our video on the Karachay-Balkar Republic, there is a significant ethnic divide in the republic, with Karachay's more prominent in the eastern districts, Abazin and Nogai in the north, while Cherkess and Russians populate the west. This division is not so much on purpose, but more the result of historical decisions, something that we will cover later in this video. The flag of the republic is a tricolour of blue, green and red, with mountains in the middle and the sun rising behind. The blue represents peace, the green represents fertility, and the red unity. The mountains are said to represent the Caucasus, and the sun prosperity. However, there is an unofficial meaning to this flag as well, with the blue representing the Turkic peoples of the Karachays and Nogai, the green for the Circassian, Cherkess and Abazin, and red for the Slavs. Whatever the truth in the matter, this flag was adopted on the 26th of July 1996. The entire region runs on Moscow Standard Time and does have its own national anthem, which is playing right now, and I will include in the description for those of you interested. The story of Karachay-Cherkessia begins all the way back in the Paleolithic era. Early humans using rudimental tools arrived in the region around 250,000 years ago. As with nearly all early history, very little is known from this period, and what we do know has been gained primarily from archaeological sources. The earliest human remains in this area were found in the Triangle Cave from the Zelenchunsky district. Who these people were, how they lived, and even how they viewed the world may be completely unknown to us. What we do know is that they were living there permanently, and they wouldn't be the last. By the 4th century BC, the Koban bronze culture was evident in the region. This culture is theorized by some to have been a Nak people-led group, and there is some debate as to whether the Nak peoples first populated this region, as opposed to a Circassian or Turkic peoples. Something we will be touching upon several times in this video is the concept of ancestry. who was in the region first. This is because it plays a significant role in the modern nationalism for both the Karachay and Adyghe peoples. Historians generally agree that the region fell under the influence of the Scythians that same century, followed by the Sarmatians a century later. The impact these new arrivals made is hard to gauge, as they left little concrete evidence of their being there. Given the few archaeological finds, the scant literary references, and indeed even the difficult terrain, it may well have meant that the inhabitants in the area were only nominally included in the Sarmatian and Scythian states, possibly wholly left alone. Huns and Khazars would both come in their own times, but would play small roles in shaping the region, leaving the mountains to those who called them home. The first outsiders who truly began to shape the region arrived in the 3rd century AD. The Alans, another Iranian people, had migrated westward and began to settle in the central northern Caucasus. By the time of the Khazars, they were an established people in the lands of what is now Karachay-Cherkessia. Some Karachays claim ancestry back to these Alans, making them some of the oldest people in the Caucasus. We will explore this claim a little bit more in our video on the Karachay themselves. What is important to know is that whether this is true or not, the Alans brought Christianity into the area. Previous link to the Jewish Khazars, with Iranian independence in the 10th century, greater contact with the Christian Byzantine and Georgian kingdoms brought a flood of trade, knowledge, and prophetization to the modern lands of Karachay-Cherkessia. The Iranian state was not centered on what is now Karachay-Cherkessia. Nevertheless, they still gained benefits from this greater trade and religious conversion. Evidence of trade from as far away as both Dagestan and Crimea have been found in this area. Whether this Iranian state was uniform or more diverse is unclear. What is known is that this state began to fragment at the advent of the 12th century, making them an easy target to invaders from the east. The Mongols first arrived in 1222 from the south, making short work of the Iranian army en route to richer targets through the Caucasus. They returned from the north in 1239 and thoroughly ravaged the Iranian nation, destroying the Iranian capital of Magas and leaving a few coward Iranian nobles in charge of what remained of their state. This first Mongol invasion absolutely crushed the independence of the Iranian state. Some historians believe the Iranian capital of Magas was actually in Karachay-Cherkessia, but to me that's not the important part. What is the important part is what happened to the Alans following this invasion. As mentioned earlier, the Karachays are a Turkic people. In their own language, they call themselves mountaineers and are a similar ethnic group to the Balkars. Some believe the modern Karachays are the remnants of this Iranian population, who, in face of the fright of the Mongols, were driven to the mountains and over time Turkicized by their Mongol Tartar overlords. This is actually a process that did occur with other peoples following the Mongol invasion, and thus it is not that unreasonable to assume that's what happened here. There is, however, another school of thought. Some argue that the Karachays, as a Turkic people, arrived with the Mongol Tartar hordes and are simply those who remained after the conquest. Their location in the mountains stems directly from avoiding other Turco-Mongolic fighting in the 14th century. Where and how the Karachays arrived in the region is truly a subject for their own video. But I think it's important to help us understand nationalistic claims to the region and ancestry to understand where these claims have come from. Whether the Karachays were indigenous or later invaders, we may not know. What we do know is that the fertile plains and towns in the north of what is now Karachay-Cherkessia were destroyed. In 1395, as part of the Tokhtamysh-Tamerlane War, the Golden Horde-aligned Alania was finally put down, with Tamerlane invading with a huge force, crushing anything that remained. The brutality of Tamerlane here was notorious, and thus a flight to the mountains is perfectly understandable in the face of such chaos. What this means is that the more fertile lands in the north of the Republic were left depopulated. And as always, land is at a premium. Ilal of the Kagake tribe had been unifying the disparate Circassian tribes since around 1400, and in 1434 invaded a now much depopulated land as part of creating Great Circassia. According to Circassian records, he ousted Tatar tribes beyond the Kuban River and appointed these new lands under a prince to rule there in his stead, Kabard-Pinbay. This new land, called Kabardia after this prince, would go on to be a major Circassian population centre, stretching out into what is now the modern Kabardino-Balkar Republic as well. It is unclear the relation between the Circassians and the Karachay-Balkar people who were already there. The two population groups may have coexisted peacefully. Likewise, there may have been raids and fights for land and cattle, as was common in many parts of the Caucasus. This Circassian invasion brought the second ethnic group that still resides in the Republic to these lands. Once again, different narratives arise. Circassian sources state the land is depopulated except for a few Tatar tribes who were pushed beyond the Kuban and their vacant land settled peacefully, whereas Karachay-Balkar accounts state themselves as being forced off their own land and driven down into the mountains. Regardless of which account is correct, the Circassians became to dominate Kabardia, giving it their name, their culture, and their ideas. Meanwhile, the Karachays were driven to the mountains and began to make that their cultural grounds, with their language, their songs, and their culture dominant. Yet despite the name Karachay-Cherkessia, there are more than two ethnic groups living there, and a third was soon to arise. The Nogai had inhabited the lower Volga for centuries, and would raid the Circassians both independently as well as at the behest of Crimean paymasters. From the 15th to the 17th century, this relationship was very antagonistic. So how did the Nogai come to live here? As mentioned in our video on the Kalmykian Republic, the arrival of the Kalmyks drove the Nogai further west, nominally under Crimean protection. When that began to break in the face of Russian imperialism, the Nogai were faced with a stark choice: to be moved to the Urals or to flee. Several clans chose to flee across into what is now Karachay-Cherkessia, seeking safety from those they had once raided. This was actually not a terrible idea, as in that time, relations between Russia and Kabardia had also changed. Once allies against the Tatars, over time, Russian imperialism had chipped away at Kabardian goodwill. Serving as something of a buffer zone for both the Ottomans and the Russians, Kabardia was home to others who were seeking safety from both those powers. This was so much so that in 1739, both the Ottoman and Russian empires recognized Kabardia as being a buffer zone between them. Yet as the first Nogai clans began to settle in the northern part of what is now Karachay-Cherkessia, hungry eyes were already beginning to look at those lands. We have touched on the Caucasian War several times in different videos on this channel, so I will not spend a lot of time going over the history of that war here. What I will do is explain how it affected the lands of the Karachay-Cherkess Republic specifically and those who lived there. Fighting had begun in 1778, but it would not be until 1804 that Russian boots permanently arrived in the region. Through a mixture of cannon, Cossack and German warfare, the Russians chiseled away Circassian control piece by piece, and by 1822 the conquest of Kabardia was complete. Whilst the Circassians would continue to fight in the west, those who remained accepted Russian dominance. Incorporated into the new Kuban line, the best land was parcelled out to Cossacks to secure the area whilst the army left to move onward. Of note, one of the Russian forts was then occupied by Cossacks and turned into a stanitsa. The Cossacks decided to name the stanitsa after a Turkish general that they had killed in the recent Turkish war, Battle Pasha. Thus they named their settlement Battle Pashinskaya Stanitsa, which would one day go on to be called Cherkess. The Karachays had managed to avoid direct conflict with the Russians during their invasion and had negotiated neutrality the following year. However, ongoing hostility between the Circassians and the Russians led to the Karachays to be accused of aiding the Kabardians, and in 1828 Russian cannons were brought to the mountain villages of the Karachay and Balkar, enforcing Russian rule on the last parts of the modern republic. The arrival of Orthodox Imperial Russia and the vast colonization by Cossacks in the region fundamentally changed the demographics of the region in such a severe way it's comparable to the Mongol conquest. Islam had been making inroads in the region since the advent of the 18th century, but had found many new adherents among both the Adigye and Karachay in the 19th century. This in part made cohabitation easier in this new existence. The Kabardian supremacy was entirely gone and replaced with a Cossack one. Nogai, Karachay, Kabardians, and Abazin, who had been relocated there following surrendering tribes in 1836 onward, they were all just seen now as Muslims to the Russian state, and dangerous ones at that. In 1860, the region was incorporated into the Kuban Oblast as the Batopashinsky district. This was a classic late Tsarist society, with Russians and Cossacks at the top. Due to the poor farmland and mountainous terrain, Cossack settlement was not as widespread as in other regions, but rather centred around the narrow fertile belt in the north and the lowlands. Fear of Muslim insurrection and Ottoman fifth columnists kept Russians on high alert, and Cossack dominance and violence were a common feature of Caucasian life. For the next 50 years, the region was untouched by war, and that gave the native inhabitants some respite. The Karachay, who had avoided nearly all of the fighting, were able to maintain their population and influence in the south, accounting for over 12% of the population by the time of the 1897 census. The Nogai and Abazin, both peoples who had migrated to the region, duly farmed the scrubland they had been allotted and eked out an existence. But for the Circassians, 50 years was not long enough. Having formerly been the majority in the region, by the 1897 census, they made up just 6% of its inhabitants. In our video on the Cossacks, which, if you haven't watched so, can be found on our playlist, we touched upon the class system that was evident in Cossack society. This is important to understand what happened in Karachay-Cherkessia in the 20th century. Cossack colonization had been significant despite the terrain, and with the outbreak of war in 1914, a heightened sense of alarm was palpable in the stanitsas of Karachay-Cherkessia. In 1917, the Tsar abdicated in March, in the face of mountain pressure. As the Cossack loyalty was with the Tsar, not the state, this left them adrift in the New World Order. A Rada was quickly organised by wealthy atamans to run the Kuban Oblast in the interest of the Cossacks, not the provisional government of Russia. As the Bolsheviks seized power in St. Petersburg, the Cossack response was to declare the Kuban People's Republic on the 16th of February 1918. This was done to secure both the Cossack land and order, as opposed to the communist message coming from those in St. Petersburg. However, not all Cossacks actually benefited in their own system, and thus, alongside the peasantry who had also migrated to the area over the last 50 years, revolutionary messages began to filter through. Thus, on the 13th of April, peasants declared the Kuban Soviet Republic. The borders of both these states overlapped, and were in reality determined on a village-by-village, town-by-town basis by who simply had power in that area. Inevitably, fighting broke out, with white pro-imperial Cossacks pitted against a mixture of peasants, poorer Cossacks, and the odd Caucasian for good measure. From here, things rapidly spiralled. The Kuban Soviet Republic merged with the Black Sea Soviet Republic, making a new communist state. This was joined by others in June, making the North Caucasian Soviet Socialist Republic. At the same time, Admiral Denikin arrived in the region with his Don Cossack force from the north. At first, he was working alongside the Kuban Rada, but quickly began to supersede it. By 1919, the North Caucasian Soviet Socialist Republic had been defeated, but within a year, all that had been won by the whites was lost. Disputes between the army and the Cossacks, disputes between the Don and Kuban Cossack hosts, as well as disputes between wealthy and poor Cossacks, all contributed to a failure to support each other. And by 1921, the Karachay-Cherkess lands were firmly under Soviet control. Initially, Soviet rule was tepidly welcomed. Cossack hegemony had been horrible for the natives of the region, and Soviet claims of native empowerment and inclusion in the state were appealing to many. However, the government's understanding of the people of the region was fairly poor, and this led to some interesting decisions. In 1920, originally, both the Karachay and Kabardian autonomous districts had been established, aimed at self-rule under Soviet guidance, with a largely red Cossack population at Batopashinsky district removed entirely. This changed in 1922, when the three were grouped together into the Karachay-Cherkess Autonomous Oblast. This was widely unpopular and eventually contributed in the creation of two new entities, the Circassian National Okrug and the Karachay Autonomous Oblast, both within the North Caucasian Krai. The Kabardians were still not happy with this arrangement and managed to persuade their region to be upgraded to Autonomous Oblast as well. Why this is important is threefold. In the new Soviet system, the Caucasian natives had been told they would be equal to the Russians, and thus perceived imbalances of power was a hot topic for the intelligentsia of each ethnic group. Similarly, the inclusion of two completely different ethnic groups into one republic, whilst refusing them to connect with those ethnic groups in their neighbouring republics, as an early example of Soviet gerrymandering, designed to reduce and counteract nationalistic sentiment and problems. Lastly, autonomous oblasts could claim more rights and funding from the state, as opposed to okrugs, providing greater access to representation, opportunity, and wealth. Yet, despite what they had been promised, the Soviet reality was not at all as anyone had expected. Collectivization, modernization, and anti-religious messaging poured into the mountain communities, backed by the truck, the manifesto, and the gun. A Karachay-led revolt in 1930 had been suppressed by the Red Army after taking great swathes of the autonomous oblast, leading to hundreds of deaths. Progress was enforced in the valleys of the Caucasus, with education, health and industry promoted above regional or national interests. On the fringe of the great Soviet Empire, the Karachay-Cherkess lands did not see much of this, yet some progress was made. The Cossack named Battle Pashinsk was changed. Once in 1934 to Sulimov, named after a Soviet statesman, when he was labelled a traitor in 1938, this was quickly renamed to Yezhovo-Cherkess. The first part after Yezhov, another Soviet statesman, and the latter simply as the Russian word for Circassian, Cherkess. When he too was labelled a traitor in 1939, they cut off the Yezhovo part and simply kept Cherkess, which is the Russian word for Circassian, despite the fact that Circassians did not make up a majority in the area. Hang on, what? And it wasn't just the names that were changing. In 1937, the region was transferred from the North Caucasian Krai to the Orjokonidze Krai. This would be changed 6 years later, putting it into the Stavropol Krai in 1943. The chopping and changing, renaming and rehashing was something that was quite common across the Soviet Union during this period, as different aims and strategies were applied. This would continue even further into the post-war years. In June of 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. By August of 1942, they had reached the Karachay-Cherkess Republic. Whilst the Nazis would only stay in the region until January 1943 and were pushed out with huge human cost, the fact they had made it to the region would have terrible implications for the Karachay who lived there. Accused of collaborating with the invaders, the entire Karachay community, men, women and children, were rounded up and deported to Central Asia in horrific conditions. The Karachay Autonomous Oblast was dissolved entirely, its territory divided between the Stavropol Krai, the Krasnodar Krai, and the Georgian SSR. Their entire identity, that had been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, was wiped out. These deportations are something we will cover in more detail on the video of the Karachay themselves. After the war, more immigration to the region did occur. As there were simply not the huge industrial factories that drew large numbers of people, this immigration was fairly regional and limited, primarily focused around occupying the farms that had now been made vacant. In 1957, the Karachays were rehabilitated and their name and lands restored. Despite their time in exile, substantial numbers of Karachays had survived, and they returned to find their lands occupied. Unlike in other places like Chechnya, there were not massive riots or inter-ethnic violence. The immigration to the region had been fairly small, so the Karachays were largely able to occupy some of their old lands, if not all. In fact, the modern demographic makeup of the Republic that we mentioned at the beginning of this video dates back to this time, where the eastern lands were made more available to the Karachay, but not the western ones. As the 1980s began, nationalist rumblings began across the Union, and in Karachay-Cherkessia this was no different. In 1990, the Karachay-Cherkess Autonomous Okrug broke out from the Stavropol Krai, and declared itself a full Soviet republic. This was something that many of the autonomous okrugs and oblasts had done that year, taking as much autonomy as Gorbachev had promised they could have. This, however, spiraled, and by 1991, everyone bar the Nogai had declared their own Soviet Socialist Republic within Karachay-Cherkessia, including the Cossacks. This followed ethnic divisions in the republic, and these self-proclaimed Soviet republics were very popular in the region, despite going completely against Soviet ethos. This is so much so that it actually went to a republic-wide referendum, which was only narrowly defeated. Claims of government involvement here have been raised and in hindsight look fairly probable. Nevertheless, this referendum did not pass, and instead one republic, the Karachay-Cherkess Republic, was announced instead. The late 90s were a tough time for the region. Historically a poor area, the agriculture and limited mining of the region faced huge chaos as the Soviet Union dissolved. Islamic militantism and ethnic violence reared their ugly heads, with anti-terrorist operations in effect from 1999. But as the Russian Federation stabilized and began to successfully combat Islamic militarism in the Caucasus, progress began to be seen. In an area with 5 ethnic groups living in close quarters with minimal support from the state, you might expect it to be an area of infighting, but this is quite far from the truth. Today, Karachay-Cherkessia is one of the poorest federal subjects, dependent on state support since its inception. Indeed, of the 83 federal subjects, Karachay-Cherkessia ranked 76th for GDP in 2022. The largest industry here is agriculture, where fruit and livestock are raised in huge numbers. Going back to its Soviet past, limited mining of non-precious metals does occur in the region as well, adding meagre portions to the national GDP. Likewise, tourism, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has risen, with domestic tourists making up the vast majority of arrivals. Karachay-Cherkessia has been particularly unfortunate in its geography. On one side it has the coastal road leading to Rostov-on-Don and the Black Sea, and on the other side it has the Georgian highway. However, there is not a lot of real value between those two, and unfortunately that is where the Karachay-Cherkess Republic resides. What this means is that years of failing to invest in infrastructure has left the Republic with a single federal highway, 0 rail connections, nor a single airport. In fact, during my research, I found that the Karachay-Cherkess Republic is due to have an airport in 2028. But during my research, I also discovered that this was originally meant to be in 2025, when it was announced in 2022. This would not be quite such a problem if it had good rail links, something that most of Russia does, but the Karachay-Cherkess Republic does not. On the flip side, this isolation has made the area famous for its beauty, something we will see at the end of this video. As mentioned earlier, the population of the Republic is over 460,000 people as of the last census, making it one of the least populated federal subjects. The majority of people here are Karachays, a Turkic people at 44%. They are followed by Russians at 27%, Circassians at just over 12%, followed by Abazin at 8%, and Nogai at 3% respectively. The remaining 3.5% are made from a variety of nationalities from across the Russian Federation and beyond. Of this population, according to the 2012 survey, the majority are Muslim at 64%. Christians make up 15%, with the majority of those being Russian Orthodox. Those that are spiritual make up 10%, with atheists at just 3%. Indigenous faiths make up 2%, with over 6% of people not giving an answer. The fertility of the region is 1.35 children per woman, which is below the national average. Instances of drug and alcohol abuse are also lower than the national average, probably due in no small part that you can't get anything there. The acting head of the Republic is Rashid Temrezov, a Karachay born in Kyrgyzstan. He has been in power there since 2011, first as president of the Republic, but later on as head, when his term limit was reached. This change in title to get around the term limit was signed off by Vladimir Putin, and he is of course a member of the United Russia Party. Interestingly, he was actually a member of the A Just Russia Party until 2006, when he was kicked out for corruption. In fact, Rashid's history seems checkered with brushes with illegal activity, long stints in position of power, and very little for his republic to show for it. Yet one of the most diverse republics has not become a hotbed of inter-ethnic violence, and perhaps that is why Putin has kept him in power so long. Politics aside, Karachay-Cherkessia is famed for its beauty. Whilst I cannot in good faith suggest going now with the ongoing war in Ukraine, if you were to go, some of the things you may see are the mineral healing and spa resorts of Arkiz and Nogai, nestled high in the mountains and sporting incredible sea routes. Senti Church, one of the oldest churches in Russia that dates back to the 9th century and links to the Iranian kingdom. And of course Mount Elbrus, the highest mountain in all of Europe and all of Russia. The Karachay-Cherkess Republic is an impoverished region, failing to benefit from many of the advantages of Russian federalism. Yet despite this, it is rich in history, rich in culture, and rich in its community, which stands as a brilliant example of peaceful cooperation of people from across different parts of the Caucasus. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Up next is the Karelian Republic. Пока!